The venue looked like something out of a magazine spread white florals cascading from iron arches, violin music, drifting across manicured lawns, waiters moving with the quiet efficiency of people trained to handle important families. I stood at the entrance for a moment longer than necessary, smoothing my dress, reminding myself I was here as a sister, not a spectator. Inside, the air felt curated. Every smile is measured. Every detail is intentional. My mother spotted me first. She approached quickly, her heels clicking against marble. "You made it," she said, kissing my cheek without quite meeting my eyes. Then she turned to the couple beside her. "This is our younger daughter," she said lightly. A small pause. "The other one." The couple nodded politely, already scanning past me for someone more relevant. I felt it then, that subtle weighing. Not hostility. Assessment. As if my presence needed context. My sister, radiant in pre-ceremony silk, was surrounded by colleagues in tailored suits. "Dr. Patel," someone called, and she turned, effortlessly smiling the way people do when they're used to being celebrated. I remember thinking I had prepared myself for this. I was wrong. A folded envelope rested on the gift table with my name written across it in my mother's careful handwriting. Not on the stack with other guests. Placed separately beside the vendor invoices. I didn't realize then how important that detail would become. I didn't build my life in rooms like this. I built it in conference calls that started before sunrise and ended long after the office lights shut off. I built it in rented apartments with folding desks, in airports where no one cared about my last name, in cities where I wasn't compared to anyone. While my sister memorized anatomy charts, I was learning how to read contracts. While my parents framed her acceptance letters, I was negotiating my first seed investment in a borrowed blazer that didn't quite fit. No one flew in to celebrate when my company cleared its first profitable quarter. No one posted about it online. That should have been my first clue that I was freer than I realized. I founded a logistics software company at 27. It wasn't glamorous. It optimized supply chains for mid-sized manufacturers. There were no white coats or applause. Just data, risk, and long nights teaching myself what no one thought to teach me. When I sold 40% of it 5 years later, I paid off my mortgage in one transfer. Quietly. I reinvested the rest. Diversified. Built stability that didn't depend on applause. My parents never fully understood what I did. They would introduce me at gatherings as working in business. The way you summarize something you don't intend to explore. Meanwhile, my sister's residency updates were recited like headlines. Cardiothoracic. Fellowship. Board certified. I learned not to correct the imbalance. Not because it didn't sting, but because my success stopped needing their recognition. There's a difference between being unseen and being self-defined. By the time this wedding invitation arrived, I had employees in 3 countries and equity stakes in 2 startups. I had flown my mother first class once after her surgery, and she had spent most of the flight telling the attendant her older daughter was a doctor. I didn't resent it the way I used to. I had outgrown that particular ache. Or I thought I had. In rooms like this, where value is often measured by titles and prestige, I knew exactly who I was. Financially independent. Calm under pressure. Comfortable with numbers that once intimidated me. What I didn't expect was that those same numbers might be the reason I was truly invited. As I stood near the gift table watching my sister glow under professional lighting, I felt something shift beneath the polished surface of the evening. I had become someone without them. I just wasn't sure they had noticed. If you had asked my parents whether they played favorites, they would have been genuinely offended. "We love you both the same," my mother used to say, usually after I pointed out something small and specific. A missed recital. A canceled plan. A comparison that lingered longer than it should have. Love wasn't the issue. Attention was. My sister Anika was brilliant from the beginning. Teachers called home about her scores. Neighbors used words like gifted. My parents wore her report cards like badges. By middle school, it was understood that she was headed somewhere important. I was steady. Consistent. Good but not dazzling. When I brought home a 95, the response was often, "That's great. Your sister got a 98 in chemistry." It wasn't cruel. It was comparative. And comparison became the language of our house. Anika's achievements were milestones. Mine were expectations. When she stayed up late studying, she was disciplined. When I did, I was being responsible. The difference sounds subtle. It isn't. I remember once in high school telling my father I wanted to study computer science. He looked at me over his glasses and said, "That's very competitive. Maybe choose something more practical. Something stable." 2 years later, when Anika declared pre-med, there was no talk of stability. There were celebratory dinners. Relatives called from overseas. My mother cried in the kitchen, overwhelmed with pride. Practicality was reserved for me. When tuition bills arrived, my parents rearranged savings to support Anika's medical school. Loans were co-signed without hesitation. "It's an investment," my father explained. "She'll make it back." When I mentioned applying for a startup accelerator that required relocation, my mother frowned. "Why can't you find something close to home?" she asked. "Something secure." Secure meant predictable. Predictable meant small. I didn't argue. Not loudly. I learned early that pushing too hard made me sound ungrateful. So I adjusted quietly. Took scholarships. I worked part-time. Saved aggressively. I told myself independence was a virtue. But if I'm honest, part of me was still trying to earn something invisible. Approval doesn't always come as applause. Sometimes it comes from the absence of criticism. And for years that was enough for me. At family gatherings, introductions followed a script. "This is Anika," my mother would say proudly. "She's going to be a doctor." Applause would follow. Questions. Admiration. "And this is our younger daughter," she'd add. "She's very good with computers." Very good with computers. I smiled through it. Laughed at the right moments. Told myself it didn't matter. But it did. There's a particular loneliness in being the dependable one. You are trusted but not celebrated. Relied upon but rarely spotlighted. When things break, you're called. When things shine, someone else stands in front of them. By the time Anika graduated medical school, framed in white against hospital banners, I had already built the first version of my company. I remember standing in the crowd during her ceremony, clapping until my palms stung, watching my parents beam beside me. No one asked what I was working on that year. I didn't volunteer. That was who I was then, someone who believed success would eventually speak for itself. Someone who thought if I stayed steady long enough, the comparison would fade. I was wrong. Comparison doesn't fade on its own. It calcifies. Even when I sold part of my company, even when I wired money to help cover a home renovation my parents couldn't quite afford, the narrative didn't shift. It was framed as kindness, as generosity, not as an achievement. Anika saved lives. I optimized logistics. One sounded noble. The other sounded technical. Then I felt small. Now, standing at her wedding, watching guests orbit around her brilliance, I understood something I hadn't fully articulated before. I had spent years trying to win a race I never signed up for. And somewhere along the way, without fanfare or permission, I had built something entirely my own. The difference between then and now wasn't my income. It wasn't my title. It was that I no longer needed them to say I was enough. What I didn't yet realize was how deeply they still measured me by what I could provide. The invitation arrived 3 weeks after everyone else had already posted theirs online. Cream cardstock. Embossed lettering. My sister's full title included, as if the ceremony were a conference keynote rather than a wedding. There was no handwritten note inside. Just the printed details and a separate card outlining accommodation options for out-of-town guests. I lived 2 hours away. I remember holding the envelope a little longer than necessary, noticing the absence of something personal. "No, we can't wait to see you." No acknowledgement that I hadn't attended many family events in recent years because I'd been building something no one asked about. Later that evening, my mother called. "Did you get it?" she asked. "Yes. We had to finalize the guest list quickly," she said. "You know how expensive these venues are. Everything has to be paid in installments." It was an odd thing to mention before asking if I was coming. "I'll be there," I replied. There was a pause on the line. Then lightly, "That's good. We've had some unexpected vendor adjustments." "Vendor adjustments?" I said nothing. "Your sister's colleagues are used to a certain standard," my mother continued. "We want everything to look cohesive." "Cohesive? I'm sure it will," I said. Another pause. I could almost hear her deciding how to speak directly. "If there's anything you feel you'd like to contribute," she added carefully. "This is a once-in-a-lifetime event." There it was. Not a request. Not yet. Just a suggestion wrapped in sentiment. I told myself I was reading too much into it. Weddings are expensive. Parents worry. That didn't mean anything. But over the next week, small comments accumulated. My father texted a photo of the venue with the message, "Not cheap but worth it for her career circle." As if professional optics required investment. As if celebration were a strategic move. Then my sister called. "Can you get into town early?" she asked briskly. "We're short on people to handle some logistics." What kind of logistics? Just small things. Vendor confirmations. Seating adjustments. You're good with that stuff. Good with that stuff. It wasn't the request that unsettled me. It was the assumption. I was already assigned a role. Not a guest. Not my sister. Operational support. "I have meetings that week," I said. "But I'll manage." "Great," she replied, relieved. "I knew you'd understand." That phrase lingered after we hung up. I knew you'd understand. Understand what? That her career justified extravagance? That my schedule was more flexible? That my financial stability was a safety net? The envelope with my name on it separate from the main stack replayed in my mind. The vendor talked. The emphasis on costs. The subtle positioning of my skill set as utility. I didn't know then how important those details would become. But I felt something shift. Not accusation. Not yet. Just awareness. The kind that arrives quietly and waits for confirmation. I arrived the afternoon before the ceremony, suitcase in one hand, laptop bag in the other. The venue coordinator glanced at her clipboard when I gave my name. "Oh," she said politely. "You're in the garden wing." I had seen photos of the venue online. The garden wing was a polite way of describing the overflow building across the lawn. Most immediate family were staying in the main house. "It's lovely," she added quickly as if anticipating disappointment. I told her it was fine. It was fine. That evening during the rehearsal dinner, I searched for my name on the seating chart. My parents and sister were at the central table near the head of the room, surrounded by doctors' department heads and a hospital board member I vaguely recognized from local news. My place card was at a round table near the back beside two distant cousins and a +1 who spent most of the night scrolling through his phone. When I asked my mother about it, she smiled too brightly. "We had to prioritize professional optics," she said. "You understand." I did understand. Optics. Throughout dinner, I watched my father circulate, introducing my sister with practiced pride. "She just completed her fellowship," he told anyone who would listen. "Cardiothoracic. Very demanding." When he finally gestured toward me, it was almost an afterthought. "And this is our other daughter. She works in business." Works in business. The phrase felt like a reduction, but I kept my expression steady. One of the guests turned to me politely. "Oh, what kind of business?" "Software," I replied. He nodded vaguely, already pivoting back to ask my sister about surgical rotations. I remember thinking I shouldn't care. But repetition has weight. The next morning before breakfast, my sister knocked on my door. "Can you call the florist?" she asked, stepping inside without waiting. "There's an issue with the arch arrangement. They're short on peonies." "Isn't there a planner?" I asked. "Yes, but she's overwhelmed." "You're better at negotiating." "Better at negotiating." So I called. I handled the conversation calmly, secured a substitution, and ensured delivery timelines were intact. No one thanked me directly. The flowers simply appeared and the crisis dissolved. Later during hair and makeup, I hovered near the doorway while stylists rotated around my sister and her bridesmaids. "Do you need anything?" I asked. My mother looked at me in the mirror. "Actually, can you run down to the front desk? There's a question about the final catering installment." I hesitated. "Isn't that already paid?" She gave me a look that suggested now was not the time. At the front desk, the coordinator explained there was a discrepancy, a remaining balance that hadn't cleared. "It's probably a processing delay," she said. "But it needs to be resolved before the reception begins." I told her I'd relay the message. Back upstairs, I mentioned it quietly to my father. He exhaled, rubbing his temples. "These vendors," he muttered. "Always something. Do you need help reviewing it?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. He looked at me for a long moment. "We'll see. We'll see." Throughout the afternoon, small assumptions accumulated like static. A guest asked if I had taken time off from your little company to attend. Another inquired whether I planned to pivot into something more stable eventually. Each comment was minor on its own, none overtly cruel. But together they formed a pattern I recognized too well. During cocktail hour I stood near the bar when I overheard one of my sister's colleagues say, "It must be nice to have a sibling who isn't competitive." I almost laughed. Not competitive. As if my absence from the spotlight had been a choice rather than a role assigned early. When my mother introduced me to a senior surgeon, she said, "She's always been very supportive of her sister's career." Supportive. Not accomplished. Not successful. Supportive. I watched the word settle in the surgeon's expression, shaping his understanding of me before I spoke. "I actually run a logistics firm," I clarified gently. "Oh," he said, mildly surprised. "How nice. How nice." The phrase echoed in my head. I began to notice how often I was handed tasks. Confirm this vendor. Check that invoice. Adjust that seating card. Small responsibilities framed as helpful contributions. No one asked if I wanted them. No one asked how my own work was going. I moved through it calmly and efficiently, solving, adjusting, managing. Then as the reception hall filled and guests took their seats, I saw something that made my stomach tighten. Near the gift table beside the decorative box for envelopes sat a stack of vendor invoices clipped neatly together. On top of them was the envelope with my name, separate. I didn't know then how important that detail would become. But I felt it. The difference between being included and being positioned. And for the first time all weekend I stopped moving automatically. I started watching. It happened in the hallway outside the reception hall near the service entrance, where staff moved quickly and guests rarely lingered. I had stepped away to take a call from my operations director, an issue in Singapore that couldn't wait until Monday. When I hung up, I heard my parents' voices drifting from the small lounge near the kitchen. They didn't know I was there. "We're short by almost 20, my father said quietly. "I know," my mother replied. "But it's just temporary." "There's nothing temporary about invoices due tonight." A pause. Then softer, "She can cover it." My father hesitated. "That's not the point. She doesn't have med school debt," my mother said, as if that explained everything. "She's always been better with money. Better with money. She'll understand," my mother continued. "It's her sister's wedding." I stood very still, the hum of catering carts masking my breathing. Understand what? That I was the contingency plan? That my presence wasn't symbolic, it was strategic? My father exhaled slowly. "I don't want to ask." "We won't have to," my mother said. "We'll just explain the situation. She's practical." Practical. The word landed heavier than it ever had. I remember staring at the patterned carpet beneath my feet, feeling something inside me rearrange itself. Not anger. Not yet. Recognition. All weekend I had been placed slightly outside the frame. Slightly behind the spotlight. Positioned near the invoices. Given operational tasks. I had told myself it was a habit. Family dynamics resurfacing under stress. But this wasn't subconscious favoritism. It was financial planning. She doesn't have med school debt. As if that were a moral distinction. As if my stability were communal property. I didn't know then how important every small comment had been: the envelope, the seating chart, the vendor questions. Now I did. That was the moment I realized I wasn't here to celebrate. I was here to balance. I stepped back before they could see me, moving quietly down the corridor. The music from the reception hall swelled as the doors opened briefly for a passing waiter, laughter spilling into the hallway. Inside, my sister was posing for photos under chandeliers my parents could barely afford. And I was the invisible insurance policy. The realization was strangely clarifying. For years I had told myself the comparison was emotional, that the imbalance was about prestige and pride. But this was simpler. In their hierarchy, my sister was the investment. I was the safety net. And safety nets are rarely thanked. They are expected. I walked back into the reception hall, slowly taking in the scene with new eyes. Guests raising glasses. Cameras flashing. My father scanning the room with polite tension behind his smile. He wasn't looking at me as a daughter. He was calculating. I felt something settle in my chest, then not resentment but certainty. If they wanted practicality, I could give them that. But not the way they expected. I didn't confront them. Not in the hallway. Not in the middle of the reception. Not with guests circulating and cameras flashing. Instead, I returned to my seat and let the music swell around me. I watched my sister laugh at something her new husband whispered, and watched my parents beam at their carefully assembled audience. The scene was polished, expensive, fragile. If I reacted emotionally, I would become the disruption. So I chose something else. During dinner, while speeches began and attention shifted toward the stage, I excused myself and stepped outside. The wedding planner stood near a small folding table stacked with binders, her headset slightly askew. "Can we clarify something?" I asked quietly. She looked relieved to be addressed calmly. "Of course. I understand there's a remaining vendor balance," I said. "Who is legally responsible for that payment?" She blinked. "The contract is under your parents' names. Not mine." "No." I nodded. "Good. Please ensure all future payment requests are directed to them directly. If anyone suggests I'm covering shortfalls, that would be inaccurate." Her expression shifted, subtle understanding replacing confusion. "Understood." I paused. "Also, I'll be giving a gift later this evening. I'd like to confirm the microphone schedule." Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "After the best man? That works." As I walked back inside, I felt steady. For years I handled things automatically. Smoothed edges. Paid deposits without being asked. Stepped in before anyone had to articulate expectations. This time I wanted everything articulated. Documented. Witnessed. I returned to my seat just as my father stood to give his speech. He spoke about dedication. About sacrifice. About pride. He did not mention me. I didn't need him to. What I needed was clarity. And now I have it. It happened between courses when waiters were clearing plates and conversations had loosened with wine. My father approached my table smiling the way he does when he's about to frame something as reasonable. Several relatives were nearby. Two of my sister's colleagues stood within earshot. "Can we speak for a moment?" he asked, not quietly. I stood, aware of the subtle shift in attention. "There's just a small hiccup with one of the vendors," he said, keeping his tone light. "Processing delay. We're short on the final balance." He paused, glancing around as if to emphasize that this was a practical matter, not a private one. "I was hoping you could handle the remaining amount," he continued. "Just until everything clears." Handle. Around us conversations thinned. My aunt looked down at her napkin. One of the surgeons pretended to check his phone. My sister was across the room near the sweetheart table. She had heard enough to understand what was happening. She didn't look at me. "It's just temporary," my father added. "You're good with these things." There it was again. Framed as competence. Packaged as trust. But it wasn't a request whispered in confidence. It was an expectation delivered in public where refusal would feel like a spectacle. I could feel eyes on me now. Measuring. Waiting. For years I would have said yes before the sentence ended. Smoothed it over. Preserved the image. Instead, I let the silence stretch. Long enough for the tension to become visible. Then I smiled. "Let's clarify something," I said calmly. And the room grew very still. "Let's clarify something," I repeated, keeping my voice even enough to carry without rising. My father's smile faltered just slightly. "I'm not the financial sponsor of this wedding," I said. "The contracts are under your name. And the responsibility for vendor balances remains there." There was no accusation in my tone. No heat. Just a fact. A ripple of discomfort moved through the small cluster of relatives around us. My aunt shifted her weight. One of the surgeons glanced discreetly toward the bar. "It's only temporary," my father said quietly, trying to contain the moment. "We thought." "I know what you thought," I replied gently. "You thought I would handle it." Silence settled more heavily now. Across the room, my sister finally looked at me. Not angrily. Not gratefully. Just cautiously, as if trying to gauge how far I would go. "I've spent the last 10 years building something of my own." I continued, turning slightly so my voice included more than just my father. "I founded a logistics software company. We operate in 3 countries now. I financed our international expansion myself. No loans. No co-signers." A few heads turned fully then. Recognition flickered in places it hadn't before. "I didn't need to announce it," I said. "Because I wasn't competing." My father opened his mouth, but I wasn't finished. "As for a wedding gift," I added, glancing briefly toward the planner near the stage. I've already arranged one. My sister's brows knit together. In your name, I said to her directly. I've funded a 5-year scholarship at the community clinic where you completed your residency. It will cover medical training for students who couldn't otherwise afford it. The words hung in the air. It's fully endowed, I continued calmly. The paperwork is finalized. You'll receive the confirmation tomorrow. For a moment no one spoke. The music from the string quartet drifted awkwardly through the silence as if unsure whether to continue. That's generous, one of the colleagues murmured. My father's face had shifted from expectation to something more complex, surprise edged with embarrassment. I believe in supporting meaningful things, I said quietly. But I don't confuse love with invoice payments. The sentence wasn't sharp. Didn't need to be. It simply reframed the entire exchange. I turned back to my father. If there's a processing delay, the bank can resolve it. But I won't be covering balances. Around us, conversation resumed slowly but differently. Not with tension, with recalibration. I wasn't the quiet sister anymore. Not the practical fallback. Not the invisible safety net. I had just funded something larger than a vendor shortfall. And I had done it without being asked. My sister walked toward us and her expression was unreadable. She searched my face, perhaps for defiance, perhaps for apology. She found neither. I didn't know, she said softly. I know, I replied. Because she hadn't asked. That was the real shift. For the first time in my life, the narrative in that room didn't belong to comparison or assumption. It belonged to clarity. And clarity delivered calmly is louder than confrontation. I turned back to my father before the moment dissolved completely. I want to be clear, I said, keeping my voice steady but soft enough that it didn't feel like a performance. I'm here as your daughter and her sister. Not as a contingency plan. He swallowed, nodding once as if to signal agreement, though I could see the discomfort behind his eyes. Love isn't measured in payments, I continued. It's not proven by who can close a financial gap the fastest. If there's a shortfall, that's a logistical issue. It doesn't need to become a family test. My sister stood beside us, now silent but listening. I'm happy to celebrate, I said to both of them. I'm happy to show up. But I won't show up as an ATM. The word hung there, not harsh, just accurate. I've built my life carefully, I added. And I decide how my resources are used. There was no anger in me anymore. Just calm. Then I stepped back toward my table, picked up my glass, and allowed the evening to continue, this time on my terms. The reception recovered, but not in the way my parents had planned. Conversations resumed, though I noticed the glances were different now. Curious instead of dismissive. A few guests approached me later in the evening, asking genuine questions about my company. Not politely. Not as an afterthought. One of my sister's colleagues even said, I had no idea you were operating internationally. That's impressive. Impressive. The word felt unfamiliar in that room. My father avoided my table for the rest of dinner. When he did pass by, his posture had shifted, slightly less assured and more cautious. Not angry. Just aware. My mother's smile was tighter than usual, though she said nothing publicly. I could see her recalibrating the way she always did when expectations didn't unfold as rehearsed. Later, near the end of the evening, my sister found me outside on the terrace. The night air was cooler and quieter. You could have told me, she said, not accusing but unsettled. Told you what? I asked gently. About the scholarship. About everything. I looked at her for a long moment. You could have asked, I replied. She absorbed that. I didn't know they were going to ask you to cover anything, she said. I know, I answered. And I did believe her. The truth was simpler than malice. It was a habit. A lifetime of assumptions about who did what, who carried which weight. I'm proud of you, she said quietly. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't effusive. But it was the first time I had heard it without comparison attached. I'm proud of you too, I replied. We stood there for a moment, neither of us entirely sure what the new version of us looked like. In the weeks that followed, the shift became clearer. My parents called more often, though their tone had changed. There was less instruction. More inquiry. My father asked about my company once awkwardly, as if learning a new language. My mother mentioned the scholarship to a neighbor, framing it as a family achievement. They didn't apologize directly, but they stopped assuming. At the next family gathering, I was seated at the center table. No one introduced me as the other one. The dynamic hadn't dissolved into perfection. Old patterns don't disappear overnight. But something fundamental had adjusted. I wasn't the backup plan anymore. I was visible. And once visibility is claimed calmly, it's difficult to ignore. For most of my life, I was introduced as the other one. The practical one. The supportive one. The quiet one who handled things in the background, while someone else stood under brighter lights. I used to think that meant I was less impressive, less celebrated, less worthy of attention. But standing at that wedding watching a narrative shift without shouting or spectacle, I understood something I hadn't fully articulated before. Being the other one gave me something comparison never could. Perspective. I built my life without needing applause. I learned to define success without waiting for it to be announced at a dinner table. I stopped measuring myself against someone else's spotlight and started measuring myself against my own growth. Success, I realized, isn't louder because it's public. It's steadier because it's chosen. For years I thought I was growing up in second place. What I didn't see was that I was building first. And the moment I stopped trying to compete for their version of enough, I became fully my own.